Episode number 30, The Science of Connection. I'm returning, again, to the topic of human connection, focused specifically on the science of human connection. We've seen an explosion in the past 40 years in the science of human sociability. Our understanding of genetics and improved medical testing have driven a lot of this. But it has also spurred a lot of new ideas in psychology. I've been reading an accessible book about this new science titled Friendship, the Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond. This is a 2020 book by Lydia Denworth, a science journalist, contributing editor for Scientific American, and a writer for Psychology Today. The book is approachable, although also quite careful in how it presents the science. It's a little bit dry as a result of this caution, but it also gives a very comprehensive overview of the biology, the neuroscience, and the psychology of human connection. I have relatively little to say about the book, other than to give it a thumbs up for anyone interested. What I am interested in is what this science suggests about the way we organize our society. Our economics, our communities, and our politics are all explained in theories that were really developed during the 19th and 20th century. It seems that there is an opportunity to reevaluate our societies as our own understanding of ourselves improves, especially as what is being revealed is that human beings are pretty incredible in a lot of ways and seem to have certain capacities in excess of what we give ourselves credit for. But at the same time, the new science is pointing out how we've also been pretty delusional about our own individuality and how much agency we actually have. As uncomfortable as smashing delusions might be, it does unlock a potential for us to build a more human way of life. The book Friendship doesn't make any comment on the broader social questions that the science unlocks. This is a responsible science-based book after all, so speculation is not really appropriate. But I've never allowed caution to stop me from developing irresponsible opinions. And it is these irresponsible opinions that I wanted to talk about in this episode number 30 of the Pernicious Chattel channel. If this is a topic that interests you, then please stick around for the rest of the video. Our author, Ms. Denworth, makes a number of points very clearly in the book. Most importantly, our relationships are probably the most critical components of our lives. She writes, quote, "Family and romantic relationships hold enormous power over us and reverberate throughout our lives for good and for ill. When these bonds are happy, they bring us great joy and fulfillment. When they're unhappy, they make us miserable, sometimes crippling us psychologically," close quote. In fact, the book goes on to outline how solid, nurturing friendships are critical for success in life. Our relationships allow for health to the point where the opposite, loneliness, is as hazardous for our health as smoking. The quality of our friendships are necessary to being happy. Relationships are also critical to having opportunities, critical to our creativity, and critical to our ability to manage stress or anxiety. Essentially, friendships are so critical to us as humans, and to many non-human species as well, that our current tendency to undervalue them is simply unhealthy. This is the reason why, in many of my earlier video essays, I use the phrase our human social superorganism. Despite the complexity and uniqueness of our internal dialogue, human beings do not possess a fully autonomous consciousness. The clear singular center of our consciousness, the organ that defines our own unique identity, is our biological brain. We think of this brain, encased in a hard shell of bone, physically isolated from the world and fed only through the medium of our senses, must be independent from the gray head meat of other upright, naked, primate fellows. But science is proving that perception is a mistake. Quote, The brain does not exist in isolation, but rather is a fundamental component of developing and aging individuals who themselves are mere actors in the larger theater of life. This theater is undeniably social, beginning with prenatal care, mother-infant attachment, and early childhood experiences, and ending with loneliness or social support and with familial or social decisions about care for the elderly, close quote. If any of you watched a few of my videos, you're probably shaking your head right now and saying, Jesus, XCG, repeat yourself much? You've said the same thing over and over again. While I can't deny my tendency to be ridiculously repetitive, I do have an excuse. When I wrote my first essay on this topic, I was sharing my own impressions and was informed by a level of general knowledge, but I wasn't really informed by any specific detailed research on the topic. As I satisfied my own interest and have continued to read, I've discovered that there is much more scientific research to support my opinion than I expected, and that the research is revealing the astounding power of this social component of humanity. Perhaps my fascination is also in itself revealing. The fact that I am so surprised and transfixed by this topic results from uneducated error, a personally deeply held assumption, if you will, that presumes me to be independent, when in fact I'm like every other human, deeply dependent. Dependent in the sense that my existence itself remains contingent on my connection to others. This evolving understanding is reinforced by science, a science that finds sociability to be far more powerful a force than most researchers initially hypothesize. As Denworth reviews the new science, she repeatedly categorizes research results as being more significant than researchers expected. For instance, they expected to see a correlation between sociability and physical health or reproductive success. What research did show is that rather than sociability being one influence among others, it has often turned out to be the critical factor in life outcomes. As the availability of these facts has grown, so has the understanding of the implications. Sociability has always been understood as being a fact of human behavior, important, but not necessarily the most important aspect of what we are. The facts indicate that sociability is actually far more than just a behavioral tendency. Rather, sociability seems to be central to why we exist at all. There is now information to conclude that sociability drove our development as a species. We now know that brain size and brain complexity is correlated to the sociability of a species. So our consciousness is an artifact of our brain's operation. But that consciousness and that brain wouldn't be anything like we have now without sociability. Sociability and our consciousness seem to be two parts of the same thing. They are distinguishable in definition, but exist only together. Our health, our reproductive success, our happiness and sense of satisfaction, our mental stability, our ability to adapt, our ability to manage stress, our ability to survive, are all inextricably intertwined with our ability to socialize. This isn't some random development. This isn't some mistaken outgrowth of random genetic mutations, because science is showing that these behaviors and these outcomes exist in all mammals and extremely comparably in other primate species, those animals that are most like us. Scientists, as a result, conclude that evolution selected sociability as it was so important for species success. Take, for instance, a ubiquitous social behavior like play. It is a behavior we see in almost every higher species and, quote, it has evolved over eons in many animal species to promote survival. It shapes the brain and makes animals smarter and more adaptable. In higher animals, it fosters empathy and makes possible complex social groups. For us, play lies at the core of creativity and creation, close quote. So rather than saying humans are creative and social, we need to say we are social and as a result, also creative. Sociability isn't a part of who we are. Sociability predates and allows for who we are. As one reviews the science, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Sociability underlies every assumption we make about our behavior. The science also disturbs the entire way we define a human individual, that is, a person, as something separate from society. Again, this turns out to be not true. Denworth quotes Steve Cole, a professor of medicine and psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences at UCLA. Quote, "On a molecular level, our bodies are artifacts, things that culture make," he once told an audience in Los Angeles. "They are far more fluid and permeable to environmental influence than we appreciate." Close quote. What Cole has uncovered through his research is that our physical makeup is directly modified by our society. This takes place through a process known as transcription. Our DNA is not a singular recipe with a single outcome. Rather, our DNA is a set of human possibilities that only become specific outcomes once they are transcribed into RNA. This takes place as neurotransmitters or hormones are released in our body. These chemical signals travel through our body and meet receptors on the surface of cells. These receptors are then turned on or turned off switches for gene expression within the cell. According to Cole, quote, "that allows things that are fundamentally outside us and may not be physical events except perhaps at the level of photons falling on the retina or sound waves bouncing across the ear to become real biochemistry within the body that flips on or suppresses the activity of a particular gene," close quote. These effects then include biochemical changes that result from our emotions and relations. One example is the difference between the outcomes for HIV infections in closeted gay men versus the outcomes in out gay men. The prognosis for closeted gay men is worse than for open and out gay men. The critical factor being the force of social stigma, a form of social stress, speeds up the pathology of the virus. When one stops for a moment to ponder this direct causal link between what we experience and literally how we're built, it immediately becomes evident that huge implications exist for society, for economics, and for politics. The society that we create and the experiences any individual has aren't going to just affect how they feel, but in a real measurable way are going to affect who they are, their health, their thinking itself. As a person has experiences, their body is reacting to those experiences, and those reactions are triggering their DNA on or off. And these gene expressions are changing a person physically. If stress triggers a negative physical change in a person's body, then there is actually less difference between a verbal argument and a physical violent fight than we would have first assumed. And an insult, at least theoretically, could generate a physical outcome every bit as significant as a punch. Of course, our genetic makeup, or DNA, is unique to us as an individual, but how that recipe translates into the person we are is dependent on the conditions, both physical and social, that we live in. To return to genetics and homosexuality, there is a well-documented relationship between birth order and homosexuality in men. The more older brothers a man has, the greater the likelihood that boy will turn out to be gay. This outcome makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, as homosexual men have often played specific roles in traditional societies, and being gay would remove them from reproductive competition in a tribe with a higher percentage of male members. These gay men could provide support to their tribe suitable to the tribe's needs and in line with the tribe's gender balance. So a way of being that some people like to describe as a lifestyle choice is at least sometimes clearly an artifact of natural processes with evolutionary value that take place as a result of social conditions. With all this new information in mind, I've been pondering what this means for politics and economics. Consider classical economics, with its central assumption that the market operates through each individual competing with all others, and where each decision is based on a logical process of satisfying individual wants and needs. These assumptions are untrue because it assumes that humans are something we're not. Our behavior isn't primarily competitive, it's primarily cooperative. We don't make decisions only based on a logical process, nor do we have truly individual wants and needs. Each individual is a product of society, their being and their thoughts are shaped by that society, and they probably want a lot of things that are as much about group goals as their individual wants. Personally, I think this explains a lot of the uselessness that characterizes much of economic theory. For instance, arguing that the stock market responds mostly to concrete business conditions and actual company value is utter nonsense. The stock market responds to human emotion and responds to a type of group irrational belief as much as it responds to any rational or logical thought. Certainly there is a component of rational thought involved, but trends are, as often as not, the result of fads. Obviously, bubbles are a concrete example of this type of behavior. Similarly, the type of mercenary individualism that characterizes neoconservative political movements, arguing the society itself doesn't exist, is a particularly science-blind belief. No person is capable of success purely independently, and success is linked with a myriad of circumstances and conditions so outside of anyone's control that it might simply be called pure dumb luck. On this basis, arguing that we should always prefer equality of opportunity over equality of outcome is ridiculous. This is where I must hold most so-called conservatives in utter contempt, not on the basis that they're evil, but rather either profoundly stupid, horribly badly informed, or naively delusional. Of course, individual willpower and decisions are necessary in success. But both success and failure remain highly possible for a motivated person. Not every successful person is uniquely strong-willed, and not every failure is uniquely weak-willed. To argue that way is, well, stupid. Denworth presents the material of a pair of psychologists, Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary, who published a seminal paper, The Need to Belong, Desire for Interpersonal Attachments as a Fundamental Human Motivation, in 1995. That paper has been so influential that over 18,000 academics have cited it. Compare this to a normal paper where 100 citations would be considered successful. The insight presented in the paper is that the most important motivation in decision-making is a desire to belong. As a result, consciously or unconsciously, people seek to form emotional bonds with others and will tend to avoid any action that would disrupt those bonds. These desires then affect every decision we make and will underlie our beliefs, even if we think our positions are rational. If I am to be honest about my own thinking, I have to agree. I worked hard at a job I didn't enjoy for decades. If I was asked about that, I might talk about the money or the prestige, but that wasn't the most fundamental motivation. What I wanted was to have the recognition and perceived attractiveness that our society attaches to people with money and quote-unquote success. Of course I wanted financial security. Of course I wanted to give my children opportunities and to be able to buy things. But that wasn't really the motivation, at least once I satisfied my basic needs. It was about my standing in the community. More than anything, it was about something concrete that I could use to bolster my otherwise low self-esteem. If I was successful, then the success was attractive. This seems somewhat self-evident now that I reflect on it. But what I find fascinating is that we seem to discard these motivations when looking at human political or economic behavior. We will hear many people talk about the ability to gather wealth as a freedom and a natural motivation. They will argue that greed is a part of our system in order to allow people to be free. But if being successful is about esteem and attractiveness more than wealth, then alternative systems should likewise allow for people to express their ambitions just as effectively as any neoliberalist capitalist system. Wealth accumulation could be replaced if we could find another way of measuring success and security. A reasonable application of the emerging science of human connections to politics is supporting human connection, contact, and interaction as an objective of the process. This means supporting distributory justice, supporting any movement where we try to make access to resources as fairly distributed as possible, and we employ a level of redistribution to ensure that no one sinks below a basic level of subsistence, decent housing, available and affordable healthcare and education. After all, our intrinsic sociability guarantees that some people in our society suffering will transfer across our community to make everyone worse off. Our politics also needs to include some allowance for mental health support, a type of support that emphasizes community health and community cooperation as much as it specifically targets the mental health of individuals. It seems a logical conclusion to the science that targeting groups as often as individuals, because we know conclusively that healthy societies tend to support healthy individuals. This doesn't mean that individuals with specific needs aren't supported, but that we don't expect individuals to stay mentally healthy in a society that it is itself sick. I would argue that this is exactly the type of politics we have now. If we live in an economically developed nation, except of course the US, we're probably afforded some government support for health and mental treatment. But what we ignore is the problem of disadvantaged communities. So we're trying to treat an individual when the illness may very well be social. Likewise, in our community design, we need to consider supporting relationships as a critical component of a successful system. For instance, the requirement to work long hours, commute, travel for work, and especially relocation for work would all be minimized, as it tends to disrupt existing important relationships in any person's life. We've come to understand how important relationships are for individuals, and that these relationships extend well beyond the traditional nuclear family bonds, yet we do very little at a social, economic, or political level to support these bonds. In fact, we are more likely to deprioritize these relationships behind most other considerations. Both as individuals and especially as societies, our dismissiveness is utterly disproportionate with the massive impact these relationships can have on mental and physical health. This becomes most noticeable at the extremes. No one should be separated from their community on the basis of poverty. For instance, in a system where base pay is so low that a person has to work multiple jobs just to make basic necessities, automatically excludes that person from maintaining relationships as freely as people who don't need to work as much. In this case, the individual is obviously disadvantaged and socially starved. But because sociability is a two-way street, the community, likewise, is impoverished. We really shouldn't be talking about the poor as if they're somehow different from the rest of us. Once we look at how interconnected we really are, we have to accept that we are directly socially impoverished by our neighbors' poverty. After spending some time considering these ideas, I also have to caution that it is possible to use the science to assert positions that I find horrifying, as well as those that I support. For instance, social conservatives might argue that community health is important, so imposing community-level morality is a step to supporting health. They would argue that traditional family and community structures need to be reinforced with political and legal authority. The fact that you see, for instance, high rates of drug use and other mental disorders among sex workers could be used as a reason to further criminalize and intervene in those professions. I'd argue that marginalization and shaming is the problem in the first place, but ultimately, these arguments are still raging and a broad spectrum of positions taken even among the well-educated and the literate. Another example might be Mormons with their emphasis on family and church. They would, I think, be very reassured by the science that says that social connections are good for health. Successful marriages and social connections like church affiliations do seem to give mental and other health benefits. So unfortunately, sociability benefits both groups we agree with and those that we don't. Of course, being an inveterate lefty, I suspect that forcing social conditions on people not disposed to them might not generate the benefits that the average statistics suggest. Sadly, though, there is the possibility of arguing the science either way. The issue with using this emerging information to modify our ethical, economic, or political ideas is that the science is extremely complex and does describe certain outcomes without being able to predict them. Consider the whole issue of genetic makeup and its relation to individual characteristics, whether physical or emotional. We each have a full set of DNA that is pretty individual to us, unless of course we're an identical twin. But this DNA does not determine our final presentation as a person in detail. Rather, DNA provides a set of possibilities with the final expression dependent on their conditions and experiences. So, two people with similar DNA but radically different environments will turn out differently. This variation might happen even with people with similar DNA and similar environments because minor variations in response or experience might drive different epigenetic responses. A study of human relationship networks shows that individual people do have differing tendencies to be social. A percentage of people are actually introverted or extroverted from birth, where another group, estimated at around 40 to 60% of the population, seem to be much more flexible and may be influenced one way or another depending on their environment. Even though sociability seems to be hardwired and extremely important for all of us, the quantity of that socializing can differ significantly between individuals. As a result, any changes we want to make to our political beliefs or positions need to support communities, but at the same time also allow for a lot of variability and flexibility. So all we can conclusively say is that extremely individualist positions and extremely collectivist positions are not suitable for the majority of people, and forcing them onto people is going to have bad outcomes. So I guess what I am saying, if I can present any conclusions at all, is that we can afford to modify our debates somewhat. We can say conclusively that the neoliberal or neoconservative experiments we employed from the 1980s onward are based on a flawed view of humanity. We can also say that the socialist and national experiments that try to enforce a single cultural vision on everyone are also flawed. Variability is as wired in as sociability. Trying to force human conformity or extreme individuality just isn't sustainable. I'd also think that those of us who identify as progressives need to become at least somewhat educated in the science. It gives us a unique and fact-based argument versus regressives or reactionaries. Not that your average online troll gives a toss about facts, but at least we can project a fact-based argument to avoid making wild opinionated claims ourselves. I don't know about you, but I am much more confident and collected when I enter a debate armed with facts. I think this area of inquiry is extremely exciting. It opens up all sorts of new avenues of thought, and it clears a path towards a better, a more equitable, a healthier, and a more satisfying human world. Yes, I'm taking a position that is positivist. I'm suggesting that we should be updating our political and ethical positions based on facts as they emerge, rather than clinging dogmatically to a fixed moral code. But we are learning so much about ourselves so quickly, and to allow our social sciences to lag behind our physical sciences is to waste precious time. We need to encourage ourselves and our fellows to avail themselves of the new information. We need to challenge ourselves to learn, even when the topics are complex or esoteric. There are far too many possible benefits to do otherwise. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and like. And until next time, this is XCG wishing you and your community a rapid, direct, and easy trip down the road to freedom.